Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be back here with you once again to worship God and to study His Word together, even though it's only in virtual. Before I start, let us just pray. Almighty God, our loving Heavenly Father, we come before you today to praise your holy name and to thank you for your love shown towards us. I pray that you will bless us with your presence today as we study your Word. Open our eyes to see what you're saying to us and help us to act upon what we've learned. We ask this in and through the precious name of Jesus. Amen. Let me just start with a short illustration. During a service at an old synagogue, when a particular prayer was said, half the congregation stood up and half remained seated. And the half that was seated started yelling at those who were standing to sit down. And the ones who were standing yelled at the ones sitting down to stand up. And the new rabbi didn't know what to do. So his congregation suggested he should consult the oldest member of the synagogue. The rabbi hoped that that 98-year-old elderly man would be able to tell him what the actual tradition was. So he went to the nursing home to see him. "Is this the tradition to stand during this prayer?" The old man answered, "No, that's not the tradition." "Oh, so the tradition is to sit down for the prayer?" The old man answered, "No, that's not the tradition." The rabbi now was becoming confused. "But the people argue all the time. They yell at each other whether they should sit or stand." The old man interrupted, "That is the tradition." You see, over time, people can get so lost in ritual and form, they forget about the real reason why they're doing what they're doing. They focus on the ritual and forget about their relationship with God. They come before God engrossed by the form, but without the substance. The looks are there, but their hearts are far from God. I wonder, is God missing in your life? Do you have the look of a Christian, but you haven't got a close relationship with Him? We've got to get this right. We get our relationship with Jesus right, and the rest will fall into place. Get it wrong and nothing will be right. You see, at the heart of it all, Christianity is about a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. And we must be careful not to lose God in our religion. Israel's disobedience in our day, in our reading today, is in contrast to their later obedience and subsequent victory over the Philistines. And I'm going to look at our reading today in a slightly different way than usual, looking at it basically verse by verse. In verse 4 we read this: "And Samuel's word came to all Israel." Now the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. The Israelites camped at Ebenezer and the Philistines at Aphek. And I have a map on the PowerPoint which shows you roughly where these places are in relationship to Jerusalem and the Mediterranean to give you some idea of the context of where the battle took place. The word of Samuel came to Israel. The text of the first 3 chapters of 1 Samuel, from chapter 1 verse 1 to chapter 3 verse 21, climax with the establishment of Samuel as God's spokesman, his representative. And notice that the word of the Lord in chapter 3 verse 21 has become equivalent to the word of Samuel. From the period of the Judges through to the end of David's reign, the Philistines, the sea people, were an ever-present enemy of Israel. They were non-Semitic immigrants who settled down along the coastal regions of southern Canaan, organising their power in 5 chief cities: Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. Now, the location of Ebenezer has not been specifically identified, but it is opposite Aphek in Israelite territory, and is possibly modern Izbek Sartar on the road to Shiloh. Aphek itself is located near the source of the Yarkon River at the southern end of the coastal plain of Sharon, approximately 5 miles east of the Mediterranean. and this city marked the northeastern edge of the Philistine territory. The battle with the Philistines has been an ongoing thing. The Israelites might win a war against them, but they never seem to get rid of them completely. The word Samuel is actually a word from God, and the word "and" shows us that this is a continuation of the last chapter. Eli was so old at this time that God was now speaking through Samuel. The Lord is about to punish Eli, his 2 sons, and all the people because of their disobedience to his commandments. So we come to verse 2, where we read, "The Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel, and as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. The Philistines formed in line of battle and so invited and challenged the Israelites to fight them. And as the battle spread, engaged with each other, the Israelites did the same, putting themselves in a proper form and posture for fighting. And then they forsook the battle and fled, which brought on their destruction. Flight being, as the Jews say, the beginning of fall or ruin, as it follows. Israel was defeated by the Philistines. They had the worst of it, and they were beaten. About 4,000 of them were killed on the battlefield." And so we come to verse 3. "When the soldiers returned to camp, the elders of Israel asked, 'Why did the Lord bring defeat on us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, so that he may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies.' Why did the Lord bring defeat on us today?" The question of the elders reflected their knowledge that the Lord both fought their battles and allowed their defeat. To be defeated clearly meant that God was not among them. We read in Numbers chapter 14, verse 42, "Do not go up, because the Lord is not with you. You will be defeated by your enemies." But instead of inquiring of the Lord for direction, they proceeded to take the matter into their own hands. "Let us fetch the ark." The Ark of the Covenant was the representation of the throne of the God in Israel. It was kept in the most holy place in the tabernacle. The people never saw it. Only the high priest entered and saw the ark, and then only once a year. The elders wanted to take this representation of the throne of God out of the Holy of Holies. It could be moved when the tabernacle was to be moved. Cover it and bring it into battle with them. And they hoped that it would give confidence that God was really with them. The ark had gone into battle before. It went in front of the marchers around the city of Jericho, as we can read in Joshua chapter 6. And Moses told the priest to lead the ark into battle against the Midianites, which we read in Numbers chapter 31. Later, Saul brought the ark into battle, 1 Samuel 14, as did David, 2 Samuel 11. It may save us. The elders rightly sensed they needed God's help to win the battle. But they were wrong in the way they sought help. Instead of humbly repenting and seeking God, they turned to methods that God had never approved. All they cared about whether it worked. They believed the presence of the ark would make God work for them. No doubt it seemed to them like a brilliant suggestion. They were probably pleased to have arrived at such a great solution, that it may save us from the hand of our enemies. You see, they looked to the ark to save them, and not to the Lord. The ark symbolized the presence and power of the Lord, and yet Israel was treating it like a good luck charm, which would ensure them victory over the Philistines. Knowing that victory or defeat depended on the Lord's presence, they confused the symbol of his presence with his actual presence. And in this way, their understanding of God resembled that of the Philistines. The ark symbolized the ruling presence of God among his people. But the low spiritual condition of the Israelites here caused them to confuse the symbol with that which it symbolized, so that they took the ark into battle. Although the ark had been present when they crossed the Jordan River, see Joshua chapter 3, and when they gained victory over Jericho, Joshua chapter 6, it was God who granted them guidance and victory. Excuse me, I do have a bit of a tickle in my throat today. Israel's plan had bordered on superstitious fetishism, if not outright idolatry, and as such it was doomed to failure. And the Israelites are surprised at their defeat in this war. They know when they lose in a battle, it's a punishment from God. And they send for the ark, believing the presence of God will cause them to win the battle, but they've forgotten the Lord blesses them when they keep his commandments. He will not save them just because they're physically carrying the ark with them. As I've said, they're using the ark as if it's some sort of good luck charm. They're not in the will of God, and the blessings of God are not with them. They've forgotten that this is conditional on their keeping his commandments. Charles Spurgeon said this: instead of attempting to get right with God, these Israelites set about devising superstitious means of securing a victory over their foes. In this respect, most of us have imitated them. We might think of 1,000 inventions, but we neglect the one thing that is needful. We forget the main matter, which is to enthrone God in the life and to seek to do his will by faith in Jesus Christ. There are plenty of Christians like these elders who, when they find themselves beaten by the world and the devil, puzzle their brains to invent all sorts of reasons for God's smiting, except the true one, his departure from them. A lot of people try to do the same thing as the Israelites. We see that some might be having family problems and they say, oh, well, if we can just go to church, then everything's going to be all right. Or they could have financial problems and they'll go to church. Or there's sickness in the family and they say, well, we've got to get into church. And they think that's going to solve all their problems. Now, if you're coming to church for the right reason, that's fine. But what we have to understand is that God's not going to be used like a mop or a dish rag, like maybe when we spill our cup of tea over, and we need God to come and wipe it up for us. But that's the way a lot of folk try to use him. When they get into trouble, they want to go and get him and use him. As soon as he cleans the mess up, then they put him back on the stand until he's needed again. What we need to see is this: just like he wouldn't let Israel use him, he won't let us use him either. And Israel found out the hard way. They thought that as soon as they got their good luck charm, then that was all it was going to take. But God showed them that he was not the kind of God that was going to be used. And we need to realise there's more to it than just showing up at church or wearing a cross around a necklace or carrying a Bible around. We can learn from what happened to the Israelites. Excuse me. And now we come to verse 4. So the people sent to Shiloh, and they brought back the ark of the covenant of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim. And Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. Hophni and Phinehas were the two wicked sons of Eli, which we can read about in chapter 2, of whom it was said they didn't know the Lord. The fact they were mentioned here together recalls the prophecy in chapter 2, verse 34, that they would die together. The Lord's presence being symbolized by the ark caused them to want to bring it to the forefront of the battle. They were not concerned for the ark, but for themselves. And the sins of Hophni and Phinehas were the very cause of the Lord not being with Israel at this time. The throne of the Lord is in heaven, but he had dwelt with the children of Israel in the sanctuary. And then we come to verse 5. When the ark of the Lord's covenant came into the camp, all Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook. As far as we know, this was the first time since the establishment of the people in Canaan that the ark had been brought from the permanent sanctuary into the camp. And the shout of joy represented the confidence of the army that now the ark had witnessed so many splendid victories of the chosen race was among them. They shouted because they thought God would win this battle for them. They wanted to use God's power when they needed him to save them. They didn't want to obey his commandments. However, it seemed that everyone in the camp shouted when they saw the ark in the camp. But for all the appearances, it really nothing. All the noise and excitement meant nothing because it wasn't grounded in God's truth. And it's the same, you could have a service where people are raising their hands and singing out loud and seemingly having a wonderful service. But if it's not grounded in their faith and their love of God and their true worship of God, it means nothing. The Israelites probably felt they were better than the Philistines because the Philistines were pagans worshipping false gods. And yet the Israelites thought and acted just like pagans, thinking they could manipulate God and force him into doing what they wanted him to do. Had they humbled themselves and prayed devoutly and fervently for success, they would have been heard and saved. You see, their shouting proved both vanity and irreligion. And then we come to the next two verses, verses 6 and 7. Hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, "What's all this shouting in the Hebrew camp?" When they learned that the ark of the Lord had come to the camp, they were afraid. "A god has come into the camp," they said. "Oh no, nothing like this has happened before." The triumphal shout of the Hebrews frightened the Philistines. They were not afraid of the Hebrews, but they were afraid of the God of the Hebrews. And the Philistines were afraid when the spies returned and reported to them the reason for the shouting. For they said, "A god has come into the camp of Israel," because the ark represented him and was the symbol of his presence. And the Philistines took the ark itself for an idol of the Israelites. They said unto us, "Woe is us, woe unto us, it's all over for us. Destruction and ruin will be our case. Victory will go on their side, now their God is among them." Nothing like this has happened before. The idol to the Philistine was thought to be the actual dwelling place of his deity. Hence, when Israel brought the ark into the camp, the Philistines concluded that God was present, an exclamation that reflected a knowledge of God's power. You see, even though the Philistines were worshippers of false gods, they still knew that the God of these Hebrews had won many battles against Israel's enemies. They knew they were no match for Israel's God. And then we come to verse 8. We're doomed. Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? They are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. The gods who struck the Egyptians? Evidently the news of God's victory over the Egyptians was common knowledge to the Philistines. And God here is speaking of Elohim, which is a plural word speaking of the one true God. The plagues with these Philistines are speaking of are the 10 plagues brought against Pharaoh to cause him to let the people go. They actually happened in Egypt before the crossing of the Red Sea. Even though they didn't understand much about God, the Philistines recognized the superiority of the God of Israel. Yet they did not submit to God, but simply determined to fight against him all the more. If they really believed their gods were greater than the God of Israel, they shouldn't have been worried. And if they believed the God of Israel was greater than their gods, they should have submitted to him. Excuse me for all this coughing. We, like them, often know God is greater and deserves our submission, but we often resist God as well instead of submitting to him. Knowledge wasn't their problem. Submission to God was. Verse 9. Be strong, Philistines. Be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight. You will be subject to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Israel's failure to uproot all the inhabitants of Canaan, see Judges chapter 1, causes them to fall under the judgment of God. And as a consequence of the judgment, Israel was enslaved to the Philistine oppression, as we can see in Judges 10. And the Philistines feared that they too would become servants of the Hebrews. But the presence of the ark didn't make the Philistines feel like giving up. Instead, it made them feel they had to fight all the harder to overcome the odds. They had the courage of desperate men. This was a call to bravery, even if they lost their lives. They would rather die than be servants of these people who had served them. Be brave and fight. These godless Philistines can teach us something. Christians need to show more of this courage. Instead of giving up when things look bad, we should trust the Lord and fight all the harder and decide we will not give up. Courage and persistence win many battles, even sometimes for the wrong side. Then verse 10 it says, "So the Philistines fought, and the Israelites were defeated, and every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was very great. Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers." Israel was defeated. There were three reasons for this great defeat. First, the Philistines fought with the courage of desperate men. Second, the Israelites felt the battle would be easy with the Ark of the Covenant, and they didn't try as hard. And finally, God did not bless Israel's superstitious belief in the power of the Ark instead of the power of God. Excuse me a second. We often make the same mistake, believing that if God is with us, we don't need to try so hard. We think if God is on our side, the work will be easy. And that may not be true at all. As it turned out, God did not feel obligated to bless the Israelites just because they took the ark into battle. He wouldn't allow his arm to be twisted by the superstitions of the Israelites. God is a person, not a genie to be summoned at the will of man. Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers. Not only did Israel lose, they also lost far worse than they did before taking the ark into battle. The loss which prompted them to take the ark resulted in the death of about 4,000 men of Israel. With the ark, more than 7 times as many men of Israel were killed. In the late 1970s, a 5-line inscription was found on a grain silo in the ruins of Isbet Sartar. When deciphered, it was found to contain a Philistine account of this battle, the capture of the ark, even specifically mentioning the high priest Hophni. This is the earliest known extra-biblical reference to an Old Testament event. The result was strictly in accordance with those immutable laws which have ever guided the connection of Israel and their God. As long as they clave to the invisible preserver and served him with their whole heart and soul, and kept themselves pure from the pollution of the idol nations around them, as long as he was in their midst, they would be invincible. But if, as now, they chose to revel in the impure joys and to delight themselves in the selfless, shameless life of the idolatrous world around them, and only carried the ark on their shoulder with no memory of him, whom the mercy seat and the overshadowing cherubim of the ark symbolized in their hearts, then, to use the solemn words of the hymn of Asaph in Psalm 78, verses 59 to 61, where the crushing defeat of Aphek and the signal glory of the Philistines are recounted in detail, let me just read those 3 verses. When God heard them, he was furious. He rejected Israel completely. He abandoned the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent he had set up among humans. He sent the ark of his might into captivity, his splendour into the hands of the enemies. We see a terrible slaughter. The men of Israel, seeing they were losing the battle, ran in every direction to get back to their homes, and when they scattered out, it made it easier for the enemy to kill them. The 30,000 that died were all foot soldiers. Israel didn't have chariots and horses to fight with. God was their strength in battle, and this time he was not with them because of their sins. And finally we come to verse 11. The ark of God was captured, and Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. The ark of God was captured. This was worse than just losing a battle. The very thing they thought would win the battle was captured. Israel made an idol of the ark. God often deals with our idols by taking them away. We can make good things idols. There was nothing wrong with the ark itself. God had commanded them to make it. It was important to Israel. He told them to put the tablets of the law, a jar of manna, and Aaron's rod that budded in the ark. Yet even a good thing like the ark can be made into an idol, and God won't tolerate our idols. The ark of God was captured, but the God of the ark was still on his throne in heaven and guiding these circumstances for his glory. Israel thought that they could ignore the God of the ark and find deliverance in the ark of God. God showed he was greater than the ark. One final note, the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. The priests who were supposed to supervise the ark were killed in the battle. God promised the 2 sons would die in the same day as proof of his ultimate judgment on the house of Eli in 1 Samuel 2:34. And now the proof of judgment came. And a bit further on we read how Eli also died. There's a lot we can learn from this passage, and I pray that we will all listen to what God has said to us today and act accordingly.